Let us begin. We are on chapter 31. Last we met our friend Chiaroscuro, a rat who is obsessed with light and has discovered that he is a rat and discovered that being a rat is something that he doesn't want to be for a brief time. And then, upon discovering that, also seen the look on the Princess P's face. And now has decided that he wants revenge for the look of disgust he saw on the Princess P's face. So we are also introduced to Miggery Sao, who has had rather a rough life, and is now a castle servant after having been sold by her father, who is incidentally in the dungeon. So she's been sold by her father to someone who eventually is found out, and then she's taken to the castle and made a castle servant. But she's not very good at things, and she's sort of lazy. So she's now been demoted to dungeon lunch bringer. And here we are, chapter 31, A Song in the Dark. The terrible foul odor of the dungeon did not bother Meg. Perhaps that is because sometimes, when Uncle was giving her a good clout to the ear, he missed his mark and delivered a good clout to Meg's nose instead. This happened often enough that it interrupted the proper workings of Meg's olfactory senses. And so it was that the overwhelming stench of despair and hopelessness and evil was not at all discernible to her, and she went happily down the twisting and turning stairs. "Go!" she shouted. "It's dark, ain't it?" "Yes, it is, Meg," she answered herself. "But if I was a princess, I would be so glittery light-like, there wouldn't be a place in the world that was dark to me." At this point, Miggery Sao broke into a little song that went something like this. "I ain't the Princess P, but someday I will be. The P-ha-he, someday I will be." Meg, as you can imagine, wasn't much of a singer, more of a bellower, really. But in her little song there was, to the rightly tuned ear, a certain kind of music. And as Meg went singing down the stairs of the dungeon, there appeared from the shadows a rat wrapped in a cloak of red and wearing a spoon on his head. "Yes, yes," whispered the rat. "A lovely song, just the song I've been waiting to hear." And Roscuro quietly fell in step beside Miggery Sao. At the bottom of the stairs, Meg shouted out into the darkness. "Go, it's me, Miggery Sao. Most calls me Mig, delivering your food. Come and get it, Mr. Deep Downs." There was no response. The dungeon was quiet, but it was not quiet in a good way. It was quiet in an ominous way. It was quiet in the way of small, frightening sounds. There was the snail-like slither of water oozing down the walls, and from around a darkened corner there came the low moan of someone in pain. And then, too, there was the noise of the rats going about their business, their sharp nails hitting the stones of the dungeon, and the long tails dragging behind them, through the blood and muck. Reader, if you were standing in the dungeon, you would certainly hear all of these disturbing and ominous sounds. If I was standing in the dungeon, I would hear these sounds. If we were standing together in the dungeon, we would hear these sounds and we would be very frightened. We would cling to each other in our fear. But what did Miggery Sao hear? That's right, absolutely nothing. And so she was not afraid at all, not in the least. She held the tray up higher, and the candle shed its weak light on the towering pile of spoons and bowls and kettles. "Go," said Meg. "Look at them things. I had never imagined there could be so many spoons in the whole wide world." "There's more to this world than anyone could imagine," said a booming voice from the darkness. "True, true," whispered Roscuro. "The old jailer speaks true." "Go," said Meg. "Who said that?" And she turned in the direction of the jailer's voice. Chapter 32. Beware of the Rats. The candlelight on Meg's tray revealed Gregory limping toward her, the thick rope tied around his ankle, his hands outstretched. "You, Gregory presumes, have brought food for the jailer." "Go," said Meg. She took a step backwards. "Give it here," said Gregory, and he took the tray from Meg and sat down on an overturned kettle that had rolled free from the tower. He balanced the tray on his knees and stared at the covered plate. "Gregory assumes that today again there is no soup." "Eh?" said Meg. Soup, shouted Gregory. Illegal, shouted Mig back. Most foolish, muttered Gregory as he lifted the cover off the plate. Too foolish to be born, a world without soup. He picked up a drumstick and put the whole of it in his mouth and chewed and swallowed. Here, said Mig, staring hard at him. You forgot the bones. Not forgotten. Chewed. Gore, said Mig, staring at Gregory with respect. You eat the bones. You're the most ferocious. Gregory ate another piece of chicken, a wing, bones and all, and then another. Meg watched him admiringly. Someday, she said, moved suddenly to tell this man her deepest wish, I will be a princess. At this pronouncement, chiaroscuro, who was still at Meg's side, did a small, deliberate jig of joy. In the light of the one candle, his dancing shadow was large and fearsome indeed. Gregory sees you, Gregory said to the rat's shadow. Roscuro ceased his dance. He moved to hide beneath Mig's skirts. Eh? Shouted Mig. What's that? Nothing, said Gregory. So you aim to be a princess? Well, everybody has a foolish dream. Gregory, for instance, dreams of a world where soup is legal. And that rat, Gregory is sure, has some foolish dream too. If only you knew, whispered Roscuro. What? Shouted Mig. Gregory said nothing more. Instead, he reached into his pocket and then held his napkin up to his face and sneezed into it once, twice, 3 times. Bless you, shouted Mig. Bless you, bless you. Back to the world of light, Gregory whispered, and then he balled the napkin up and placed it on the tray. Gregory is done, he said, and he held the tray out to Mig. Done, are you? Then the tray goes back upstairs. Cook says it must. You take the tray to the deep downs, you wait for the old man to eat, and then you bring the tray back. Then there's instructions. Did they instruct you too to beware of the rats? The what? The rats. What about him? Beware of them, shouted Gregory. Right, said Mig. Beware the rats. Roscuro, hidden beneath Mig's skirts, rubbed his front paws together. Water all you like, old man, he whispered. My hour has arrived. The time is now, and your rope must break. No nibbling this time. Rather a serious chew that will break it in 2. Yes, it's all coming clear. Revenge is at hand. Chapter 33. A Rat Who Knows Her Name. Meg had climbed the dungeon stairs and was preparing to open the door to the kitchen when the rat spoke to her. May I detain you for a moment? Meg looked down to her left and then to her right. Down here, said Roscuro. Meg looked at the floor. Gore, she said. But you're a rat, ain't you? And didn't the old man just warn me of such? Beware the rats, he said. She held the tray up higher so that the light from the candle shone directly on Roscuro and the golden spoon on his head and the blood-red cloak around his neck. There's no need to panic, none at all, said Roscuro. As he talked, he reached behind his back, and using the handle, he raised the soup spoon off his head, much in the manner of a man lifting his hat to a lady. Gore, said Mig, a rat with manners. Yes, said Roscuro. How do you do? My papa had him some cloth much like yours, Mr. Rat, said Mig. Red like that. He traded me for it. Ah, said Roscuro, and he smiled a large, knowing smile. Ah, did he really? That is a terrible story, a tragic story. Reader, if you'll pardon me, we must pause for a moment to consider a great and unusual thing, a portentous thing. That great, unusual, portentous thing is this. Roscuro's voice was pitched perfectly to make its way through the tortuous path of Mig's broken-down cauliflower ears. That is to say, dear reader, Miggery Sow heard, perfect and true, every single word the rat Roscuro uttered. You have known your share of tragedy, said Roscuro to Mig. Perhaps it is time for you to make the acquaintance of triumph and glory. Triumph, said Mig. Glory? Allow me to introduce myself, said Roscuro. I am chiaroscuro. Friends call me Roscuro, and your name is Miggery Sow. And it is true, is it not, that most people call you simply Mig? Ain't that the thing, shouted Mig. "A rat who knows my name." "Miss Miggery, my dear, I do not want to appear too forward so early in our acquaintance, but may I inquire, am I right in ascertaining that you have aspirations?" "What do you mean, aspirations?" shouted Mig. "Miss Miggery, there is no need to shout, none at all. As you can hear me, so I can hear you. We two are perfectly suited, each to the other." Roscuro smiled again, displaying a mouthful of sharp yellow teeth. "Aspirations, my dear, are those things that would make a servant girl wish to be a princess." "Gore," agreed Mig. "A princess is exactly what I want to be." "There is, my dear, a way to make that happen. I believe that there is a way to make that dream come true." "You mean that I could be the Princess P?" "Yes, your highness," said Roscuro, and he swept the spoon off his head and bowed deeply at the waist. "Yes, your most royal highness, Princess P." "Gore," said Mig. "May I tell you my plan? May I illustrate for you how we can make your dream of becoming a princess a reality?" "Yes," said Mig. "Yes." "It begins," said Roscuro, "with yours truly in the chewing of a rope." Meg held the tray with the one small candle burning bright, and she listened as the rat went on, speaking directly to the wish in her heart. So passionately did Roscuro speak, and so intently did the serving girl listen, that neither noticed that the napkin on the tray moved. Nor did they hear the small mouse-like noises of disbelief and outrage that issued from the napkin as Roscuro went on unfolding, step by step, his diabolical plan to bring the princess to darkness. End of the third book. Book the fourth, Recalled to the Light. And I'm just going to see how many books there are. There are 4 books, so we are on the last book. I don't think we'll finish tonight, but probably tomorrow, provided we do a story tomorrow. I think we will. Anyways, Recalled to the Light. Chapter 34, Kill 'em, even if they's already dead. Reader, you did not forget about our small mouse, did you? Back to the light. That was what Gregory whispered to him when he wrapped Desperaux in his napkin and placed him on the tray. And then Mig, after her conversation with Roscuro, carried the tray into the kitchen, and when she saw Cook, she shouted, "It's me, Miggery Sow, back from the deep downs."
"Oh, lovely," said Cook. "And ain't we all relieved?"
I might change Cook's voice, because Cook, I think, is a woman. Mig put the tray on the counter.
Here, said Cook. "Your duties ain't done. You must clear it."
"How's that?" shouted Mig.
"You must clear the tray,"
shouted Cook. She reached over and took hold of the napkin and gave it a good shake, and Desperaux tumbled out of the napkin and landed right directly plop in a measuring cup full of oil.
"Ah," said Cook, "a mouse in my kitchen, in my cooking oil, in my measuring cup. You, Mig, kill him directly."
Meg bent her head and looked at the mouse slowly sinking to the bottom of the glass cup. "Poor little Missy," she said, and she stuck her hand into the oil and pulled him out by his tail. Desperaux, gasping and coughing and blinking at the bright light, could have wept with joy at his rescue, but he was not given time to cry.
"Kill him,"
shouted Cook. "Go," said Meg. "All right." Holding Desperaux by the tail, she went to get the kitchen knife. But the mouse tail, covered as it was in oil, was slick and difficult to hold on to, and Meg, in reaching for the knife, loosened her grip and Desperaux fell to the floor. Meg looked down at the little bundle of brown fur. "Go," she said. "That killed him for sure."
"Kill him even if he's already dead," shouted Cook. "That's my philosophy with mice. If they're alive, kill 'em. If they're dead, kill 'em. That way you can be certain of having yourself a dead mouse, which is the only kind of mouse to have."
"That's some good prophecy, that is. Kill him even if they's already dead."
"Hurry, you cauliflower-eared fool," shouted Cook. "Hurry!"
Desperaux lifted his head from the floor. The afternoon sun was shining through the large kitchen windows. He had time to think how miraculous the light was, and then it disappeared and Mig's face loomed into view. She studied him, breathing through her mouth. "Little Missy," she said, "ain't you going to skedaddle?" Desperaux looked for a long moment into Mig's small, concerned eyes, and then there came a blinding flash and the sound of metal moving through the air as Mig brought the kitchen knife down, down, down. Desperaux felt a very intense pain in his hindquarters. He leapt up and into action. Reader, he scurried. He scurried like a professional mouse. He zigged to the left. He zagged to the right. "Go!" shouted Mig. "Missed him." "Ain't that a surprise?" said Cook, just as Desperaux scurried under a crack in the pantry door. "I got the little meaty's tail, though," said Mig. She bent over and picked up Desperaux's tail and held it up, proudly displaying it to Cook. "So," shouted Cook, "what good will that do us when the rest of them have disappeared into the pantry?" "I don't know," said Mig, and she braced herself as Cook advanced upon her, intending to give her a good cloak to the ear. "I don't know." Chapter 35. The Knight in Shining Armor. Desperaux was wondering the reverse of that question. He was wondering not what he would do with his tail, but what he would do without it. He was sitting on a bag of flour high atop a shelf in the pantry, crying for what he had lost. The pain in his hindquarters was intense, and he wept because of it. But he also cried because he was happy. He was out of the dungeon. He had been recalled to life. His rescue had happened just in time for him to save the Princess P from the terrible fate that the rat had planned for her. So Desperaux wept with joy and with pain and with gratitude. He wept with exhaustion and despair and hope. He wept with all the emotions a young small mouse who has been sent to his death and then delivered from it in time to save his beloved can feel. Reader, the mouse wept. And then he lay down on the sack of flour and slept. Outside the castle, the sun set and the stars came out one by one, and then they disappeared and gave way to the rising sun, and still Desperaux slept. And while he slept, he dreamed. He dreamt of the stained glass windows and the dark of the dungeon. In Desperaux's dream, the light came to life, brilliant and glorious, in the shape of a knight swinging a sword. The knight fought the dark, and the dark took many shapes. First, the dark was his mother, uttering phrases in French, and then the dark became his father, beating the drum. The dark was Furlough, wearing a black hood and shaking his head no. And the dark became a huge rat, smiling a smile that was evil and sharp. "The dark!" Desperaux cried, turning his head to the left. "The light!" he murmured, turning his head to the right. He called out to the knight. He shouted, "Who are you? Will you save me?" But the knight did not answer him. "Tell me who you are," Desperaux shouted. The knight stopped swinging his sword. He looked at Desperaux. "You know me?" he said. "No," said Desperaux, "I don't." "You do," said the knight. He slowly took the armor off his head and revealed nothing. No one. The suit of armor was empty. "No, oh no," said Desperaux. "There is no knight in shining armor. It's all just make-believe, like happily ever after." And in his sleep, reader, the small mouse began to cry. Chapter 36. What Mig Carried. And while the mouse slept, Rescuro put his terrible plan into effect. Would you like to hear, reader, how it all unfolded? The story is not a pretty one. There is violence in it and cruelty. But stories that are not pretty have a certain value too, I suppose. Everything, as you well know, having lived in this world long enough to have figured out a thing or two yourself, cannot always be sweetness and light. Listen, this is how it happened. First, the rat finished once and for all the job he had started long ago. He chewed through Gregory's rope, all the way through it, so that the jailer became lost in the maze of the dungeon. Late at night, when the castle was dark, the serving girl Migri Sao climbed the stairs to the princess' room. In her hand she carried a candle, and in the pockets of her apron were two very ominous things. In the right pocket, hidden in case they should encounter anyone on the stairs, was a rat with a spoon on his head and a cloak of red around his shoulders. In the left pocket was a kitchen knife, the same knife that Migri Sao had used to cut off the tail of a certain mouse. These were the things, a rat and a knife and a candle, that Mig carried with her as she climbed up the stairs. "Go," she shouted to the rat. "It's dark, ain't it?" Yes, whispered Rescuro from her pocket. "It is quite dark, my dear." "When I'm princess," began Mig. "Shh," said Rescuro. "May I suggest that you keep your glorious plans for the future to yourself? And may I further suggest that you keep your voice down to a whisper? We are, after all, on a covert mission. Do you know how to whisper, my dear?" "I do," shouted Mig. "Then please," said Rescuro,
Please institute this knowledge immediately.
Go, whispered Mig. All right.
Thank you, said Rescuro. Do I need to review with you again our plan of action?
I got it all straight right here in my head, whispered Mig, and she tapped the side of her head with one finger.
How comforting, said Rescuro. Perhaps, my dear, we should go over it again, one more time, just to be sure.
Well, says Mig, we go into the princess's room, and she will be sleeping and snoozing and snoring, and I will wake her up and show her the knife and say, if you does not want to get hurt, princess, you must come with me.
And you will not hurt her, said Rescuro.
No, I won't, because I want her to live so she can be my lady in waiting when I becomes the princess.
Exactly, said Rescuro. That will be her divine comeuppance.
Go, whispered Mig. Yes, a divine comeuppance.
Mig had, of course, no idea what the phrase divine comeuppance meant, but she very much liked the sound of it, and she repeated it over and over to herself until Rescuro said, And then?
And then, continued Mig, I tells her to get out of her princess bed and come with me on a little journey.
Ha, said Rescuro. A little journey. Yes, that's right. Ha, I love the understatement of that phrase. A little journey. Oh, it will be a little journey. Indeed, it will.
And then, said Mig, who was now coming to her favourite part of the plan, we take her to the deep downs, and we gives her some long lessons in how to be a serving girl, and we gives me some short lessons in how to be a princess, and when we's all done studying up, we switch places. I gets to be the princess, and she gets to be the maid. Go!
Reader, this is the very plan that Rescuro presented to Mig when he first met her. It was, of course, a ridiculous plan. No one would ever, not for one blind minute, mistake Mig for the princess, or the princess for Mig. But Miggery Sow, as I pointed out to you before, was not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And reader, too, she wanted so desperately to become a princess. She wanted, oh, how she wanted. And it was because of this terrible wanting that she was able to believe in Rescuro's plan with every ounce of her heart. The rat's real plan was, in a way, more simple and more terrible. He intended to take the princess to the deepest, darkest part of the dungeon. He intended to have Mig put chains on the princess's hands and her feet, and he intended to keep the glittering, glowing, laughing princess there in the dark forever. Chapter 37. A Small Taste. She was asleep and dreaming of her mother, the queen, who was holding out a spoon to her and saying, Taste this, my sweet pea, taste this, my darling, and tell me what you think. The princess leaned forward and sipped some soup from the spoon her mother held out to her. Oh, Mamma, she said, it's wonderful. It's the best soup I have ever eaten. Yes, said the queen, it is wonderful, isn't it? May I have some more? Said the pea. I gave you a small taste so that you would not forget, said her mother. I gave you a small taste so that you would remember. I want more. But as soon as the princess said this, her mother was gone. She disappeared, and the bowl and the soup spoon disappeared along with her. Lost things, said the pea. More lost things. And then she heard her name. She turned, happy, thinking that her mother had come back, but the voice was not her mother's. The voice belonged to somebody else, and it was coming from someplace far away, and it was telling her to wake up, wake up. The pea opened her eyes and saw Miggery Sow standing over her bed, a knife in one hand and a candle in the other. Mig, she said. Go, said Mig softly. Say it, commanded Rescuro. Mig closed her eyes and shouted her piece. If you does not want to get hurt, princess, you must come with me. Whatever for? Said the princess in an annoyed tone. As I have noted before, the princess was not a person who was used to being told what to do. What are you talking about? Mig opened her eyes and shouted. You got to come with me, so after we take some lessons, you some long lessons and me some short ones, together way down in the deep towns, I can be you and you can be me. No, shouted Rescuro from Mig's pocket. No, you're doing it wrong. Who said that? Your Highness, said Rescuro, and he crawled out of Mig's pocket and made his way up to her shoulder and situated himself there, laying his tail across her neck to balance himself. Your Highness, he said again, and he raised the spoon slowly off his head and smiled, displaying his mouthful of truly hideous teeth. I think it would be best if you do as Miggery Sow suggests. She is, as you can quite clearly see, in possession of a knife, a large knife, and she will, if pushed, use it." "This is ridiculous," said the princess. "You can't threaten me. I'm a princess." "We," said Roscuro, "are all too aware of the fact of what you are. A knife, however, cares nothing for the fact that you are royalty, and you will bleed, I assume, just like any other human." The pea looked at Mig. Mig smiled. The knife glinted in the light of the candle. "Mig," she said, her voice shaking the tiniest bit. "I really do not think," said Roscuro, "that Mig would need much persuasion to use that knife, princess. She is a dangerous individual, easily led." "But we are friends," said the pea. "Aren't we, Mig?" "Eh?" said Mig. "Trust me," said Roscuro. "You are not friends, and I think it would be best if you addressed all your communications to me, princess. I am the one in charge here. Look at me." The pea looked right directly at the rat and at the spoon on his head. Her heart skipped one beat, and then two. "Do you know me, princess?" "No," she said, lowering her head. "No, I don't know you." But reader, she did know him. He was the rat who had fallen in her mother's soup, and he was wearing her dead mother's spoon on his head. The princess kept her head down. She concentrated on containing the rage that was leaping up inside her. "Look again, princess, or can you not bear to look? Does it pain your royal sensibilities to let your eyes rest on a rat?" "I don't know you," she said, "and I'm not afraid to look at you." The pea raised her head slowly. Her eyes were defiant. She stared at the rat. "Very well," said Roscuro. "Have it your way. You do not know me. Nonetheless, you must do as I say, as my friend here has a knife. So get out of bed, princess. We are going on a little journey. I would like it if you dressed in your loveliest gown, the one that you were wearing at a banquet not so long ago." "And put on your crown," said Mig. "Put that on your princess head." "Yes," said Roscuro. "Please, princess, do not forget your crown." The pea, still staring at Roscuro, pushed the covers back and got out of bed. "Move quickly," said Roscuro. "We must take our little journey while it is still dark, and while the rest of the castle sleeps on, ignorant, oh, so ignorant, I'm afraid, of your fate." The princess took a gown from her closet. "Yes," said Roscuro to himself, "that is the one, the very one. Look at how it sparkles in the light. Lovely." "I will need someone to do my buttons," said the princess as she stepped into the dress. "Mig, you must help me." "Little princess," said Roscuro, "do you think that you can outsmart a rat? Our dear Miggery Sow will not lay down her knife, not even for a moment. Will you, Miggery Sow? Because that might ruin your chances of becoming a princess. Isn't that right?" "Gore," said Mig. "That's right." And so while Mig held the knife pointed in the direction of the princess, the pea sat and let the rat crawl over her back, doing her buttons up for her one by one. The princess held very still. The only movement she allowed herself was this. She licked her lips over and over again, because she thought that she could still taste there the sweet saltiness of the soup that her mother had fed her in her dream. "I've not forgotten, Mama," she whispered. "I've not forgotten you. I've not forgotten soup." Chapter 38. To the Dungeon. The strange threesome made their way down the golden stairs of the castle. The princess and Mig walked side by side, and Roscuro hid himself again in the pocket of Mig's apron, and Mig pointed the sharp tip of the knife at the princess's back, and together they went down, down, down. The princess was led to her fate as around her everyone slept. The king slept in his giant bed with his crown on his head and his hands crossed on his chest, dreaming that his wife, the queen, was a bird with green and gold feathers who called his name, "Philip, Philip, Philip," without ceasing. Cook slept in a too small bed off the kitchen, dreaming of a recipe for soup that she could not find. "Where did I put that?" she muttered and mumbled in her sleep. "Where did that recipe go? It was for the queen's favorite soup. I must find it." And not far from Cook, in the pantry, atop a bag of flour, slept the mouse Desperaux, dreaming, as you know, reader, of knights in shining armor,
of darkness and of light. And in the whole of the darkened sleeping castle there was only the light of the candle in the hand of Miggery Sow. The candle shone on the princess's dress and made it sparkle. And the princess walked tall in the light and tried not to be afraid. In this story, reader, we have talked about the heart of the mouse, and the heart of the rat, and the heart of the serving girl Miggery Sow, but we have not talked about the heart of the princess. Like most hearts, it was complicated, shaded with dark and dappled with light. The dark things in the princess's heart were these: a very small, very hot, burning coal of hatred for the rat who was responsible for her mother's death. And the other darkness was a tremendous sorrow, a deep sadness that her mother was dead, and that the princess could now only talk to her in dreams. And what of the light in the princess's heart? Reader, I am pleased to tell you that the pea was a kind person, and perhaps more important, she was empathetic. Do you know what it means to be empathetic? I will tell you. It means that when you are being forcibly taken to a dungeon, when you have a large knife pointed at your back, when you are trying to be brave, you are able still to think for a moment of the person who is holding that knife. You are able to think, oh, poor Mig, she wants to be a princess so badly, and she thinks that this is the way. Poor, poor Mig. What must it be like to want something that desperately? That, reader, is empathy. And now you have a small map of the princess's heart: hatred, sorrow, kindness, empathy. The heart that she carried inside her as she went down the golden stairs and through the kitchen, and finally, just as the sky outside the castle began to lighten, down into the dark of the dungeon with the rat and the serving girl. Chapter 39. Missing. The sun rose and shed light on what Roscuro and Miggery Sow had done, and finally Desperaux awoke. But alas, he awoke too late. I haven't seen her, Louise was shouting, and I tell you, I wash my hands of her. If she's missing, I say good riddance to bad rubbish. Desperaux sat up. He looked behind him. Oh, his tail. Gone, given over to the knife, and where the tail should be, nothing but a bloody stub.
And more foul play. Gregory dead, shouted Cook. Poor old man, that rope of his broken by who knows what, and him lost in the dark and frightened to death because of it. It's too much.
Oh no, whispered Desperaux. Oh no, Gregory is dead. The mouse got to his feet and began the long climb down from the shelf. Once he was on the floor, he stuck his head around the door of the pantry and saw Cook standing in the center of the kitchen, wringing her fat hands. Beside her stood a tall woman, jangling a ring of keys. That's right, said Louise. All the king's men was down there searching for her in the dungeon, and when they come back up, who do they have with them? They have the old man, dead. And now you tell me that Mig is missing, and I say, who cares? Desperaux made a small noise of despair. He had slept too long. The rat had already acted. The princess was gone.
What kind of a world is it, Miss Louise, where princesses are taken from right under our noses, and queens drop dead, and we cannot even take comfort in soup?
And with this, Cook started to cry. Shh, said Louise. I beg you, do not say that word.
Soup, shouted Cook. I will say it. No one can stop me. Soup, soup, soup.
And then she began to cry in earnest, wailing and sobbing. There, said Louise. She put a hand out to touch Cook, and Cook slapped it away. It will be all right, said Louise. Cook brought the hem of her apron up to wipe at her tears.
It won't, she said. It won't be all right ever again. They've taken our little darling away. There ain't nothing left to live for without the princess.
Desperaux was amazed to have exactly what was in his heart spoken aloud by such a ferocious, mouse-hating woman as Cook. Louise again reached out to touch Cook, and this time Cook allowed her to put an arm around her shoulder.
What will we do? What will we do? Wailed Cook.
And Louise said, Shh. There. Alas, there was no one to comfort Desperaux, and there was no time anyway for him to cry. He knew what he had to do. He had to find the king. For having heard Roscuro's plan, reader, Desperaux knew that the princess was hidden in the dungeon, and being somewhat smarter than Miggery Sow, he sensed the terrible unspoken truth behind Roscuro's words. He knew that Mig could never be a princess, and he knew that the rat, once he captured the pea, would never let her go. And so the small mouse who had been dipped in oil, covered in flour, and relieved of his tail, slipped out of the pantry and past the weeping ladies. He went to find the king. Chapter 40. forgiveness. He went first to the throne room, but the king was not there, and so Desperaux slipped through a hole in the molding and was making his way to the princess's room when he came upon the mouse council, 13 mice and one most very honored head mouse, sitting around their piece of wood debating important mouse matters. Desperaux stopped and stood very still.
"Fellow honored mice,"
said the most very honored head mouse, and then he looked up from the makeshift table and saw Desperaux. "Desperaux," he whispered. The other mice of the council leaned forward, straining to make some sense of the word that the head mouse had just uttered. "Pardon?" one said. "Excuse me?" "I didn't hear right," said a third. "I thought you said Desperaux." Whoop. The head mouse gathered himself. He tried speaking again. "Hello, members," he said. "A ghost! A ghost!" And he raised a shaking paw and pointed it at Desperaux. The other mice turned and looked, and there was Desperaux Tilling, covered in flour, looking back at them, the telltale red thread still around his neck like a thin trail of blood. "Desperaux," said Lester. "Son, you've come back." Desperaux looked at his father and saw an old mouse whose fur was shot through with grey. How could that be? Desperaux had only been gone a few days, but his father seemed to have aged many years in his absence. "Son, ghost of my son," said Lester, his whiskers trembling, "I dream about you every night. I dream about beating the drum that sent you to your death. I was wrong. What I did was wrong." "No," called the most very honored head mouse. "No." "I've destroyed it," said Lester. "I've destroyed the drum. Will you forgive me?" He clapped his front paws together and looked at his son. "No," shouted the head mouse again. "No, do not ask the ghost to forgive you, Lester. You did as you should. You did what was best for the mouse community." Lester ignored the head mouse. "Son," he said, "please." Desperaux looked at his father, at his grey-streaked fur and trembling whiskers, and his front paws clasped together in front of his heart, and he felt suddenly as if his own heart would break in two. His father looked so small, so sad. "Forgive me," said Lester again. Forgiveness, reader, is, I think, something very much like hope and love, a powerful, wonderful thing, and a ridiculous thing, too. Isn't it ridiculous, after all, to think that a son could forgive his father for beating the drum that sent him to his death? Isn't it ridiculous to think that a mouse could ever forgive anyone for such perfidy? But still, here are the words Desperaux Tilling spoke to his father. He said, "I forgive you, Pa." And he said those words because he sensed that it was the only way to save his own heart, to stop it from breaking in two. Desperaux, reader, spoke those words to save himself. And then he turned from his father and spoke to the whole mouse council. "You were wrong," he said, "all of you. You asked me to renounce my sins. I ask you to renounce yours. You wronged me. Repent." "Never," said the head mouse. Desperaux stood before the mouse council, and he realized that he was a different mouse than he had been the last time he faced them. He had been to the dungeon and back up out of it. He knew things that they would never know. What they thought of him, he realized, did not matter, not at all. And so, without saying another word, Desperaux turned and left the room. After he was gone, the head mouse slapped his trembling paw on the table. "Mice of the council," he said, "we have been paid a visit by a ghost who has told us to repent. We will now take a vote. All in favor of saying that this visit did not occur, vote aye." And from the members of the mouse council there came a tiny but emphatic chorus of ayes. Only one mouse said nothing. That mouse was Desperaux's father. Lester Tilling had turned his head away from the other members of the mouse council. He was trying to hide his tears. He was crying, reader, because he had been forgiven. Chapter 41. The Tears of a King. Desperaux found the king in the pea's room, sitting on his daughter's bed, clutching the tapestry of her life to his chest. He was weeping, although weeping, really, is too small a word for the activity that the king had undertaken. Tears were cascading from his eyes, and a small puddle had formed at his feet. I'm not exaggerating. The king, it seemed, was intent on crying himself a river. Reader, have you ever seen a king cry? When the powerful are made weak, when they are revealed to be human, to have hearts, their diminishment is nothing short of terrifying. You can be sure that Desperaux was terrified, absolutely, but he spoke up anyway. "Sir," said the mouse to the king, but the king did not hear him. And as Desperaux watched, King Philip dropped the tapestry and took his great golden crown from his lap and used it to beat himself on the chest over and over again. The king, as I have already mentioned, had several faults. He was nearsighted. He made ridiculous, unreasonable, difficult-to-enforce laws. And much in the way of Miguel, he was not exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer. But there was one extraordinarily wonderful, admirable thing about the king. He was a man who was able and willing to love with the whole of his heart. And just as he had loved the queen with the whole of his heart, so too he loved his daughter with the whole of it, even more than the whole. He loved the Princess P with every particle of his being, and she had been taken from him. But what Desperaux had come to say to the king had to be said, and so he tried again. "Excuse me," he said. He wasn't certain really how a mouse should address a king. Sir did not seem like a big enough word. Desperaux thought about it for a long moment. He cleared his throat. He spoke as loudly as he was capable of speaking. "Excuse me, most very honored head person." King Philip stopped beating his crown against his chest. He looked around the room. "Down here, most very honored head person," said Desperaux. The king, tears still falling from his eyes, looked to the floor. He squinted. "Is that a bug speaking to me?" he asked. "No," said Desperaux. "I'm a mouse. We met before." "A mouse?" bellowed the king. "A mouse is but one step removed from a rat." "Sir," said Desperaux, "most very honored head person, please, you have to listen to me. This is important. I know where your daughter is." "You do?" said the king. He sniffed. He blew his nose on his royal cloak. "Where?" he said, and as he bent over to look more closely at Desperaux, 1 tear, 2 tears, 3 enormous king-sized tears fell with an audible plop onto Despereaux's head and rolled down his back, washing away the white of the flower and revealing his own brown fur. "Sir, most very honored head person, sir," said Desperaux as he wiped the king's tears out of his own eyes. "She's in the dungeon." "Liar," said the king. He sat back up. "I knew it. All rodents are liars and thieves. She's not in the dungeon. My men have searched the dungeon." "But no one really knows the dungeon except the rats, sir. There are thousands of places where she could be hiding, and only the rats would know. Your men would never be able to find her if the rats did not want her found." "Ah," said the king, and he clapped his hands over his ears. "Do not speak to me of rats and what they know," he shouted. "Rats are illegal. Rats are against the law. There are no rats in my kingdom. They do not exist." "Sir, most very honored head person, that is not true. Hundreds of rats live in the dungeon of this castle. One of them has taken your daughter, and if you will send—" The king started humming. I can't hear you," he stopped to shout. "I can't hear you. And anyway, what you say is wrong because you're a rodent, and therefore a liar." He started to hum again. And then he stopped and said, "I have hired fortune tellers and a magician. They're coming from a distant land. They will tell me where my beautiful daughter is. They will speak the truth. A mouse cannot speak the truth." "I am telling you the truth," said Desperaux. "I promise." But the king would not listen. He sat with his hands over his ears. He hummed loudly. Big fat tears rolled down his face and fell to the floor. Desperaux sat and stared at him in dismay. What should he do now? He put a nervous paw up to his neck and pulled at the red thread, and suddenly his dream came flooding back to him. The dark and the light, and the knight swinging his sword, and the terrible moment when he had realized that the suit of armor was empty. And then, reader, as he stood before the king, a wonderful, amazing thought occurred to the mouse. What if the suit of armor had been empty for a reason? What if it had been empty because it was waiting for him? "You know me." That was what the knight in his dream had said. "Yes," said Desperaux out loud in wonder. "I do know you." "I can't hear you," sang the king. "I'll have to do it myself," said the mouse. "I will be the knight in shining armor. There is no other way. It has to be me." Desperaux turned. He left the weeping king. He went to find the threadmaster. Chapter 42. The Rest of the Thread. The threadmaster was sitting atop his spool of thread, swinging his tail back and forth and eating a piece of celery. Well, look here, he said when he saw Desperaux. "Would you just look at that? It's the mouse who loved a human princess, back from the dungeon in one piece. The old threadmaster would say that I didn't do my job well, that because you're still alive, I must have tied the thread incorrectly. But it is not so. And how do I know it is not so? Because the thread is still around your neck." He nodded and took a bite of his celery.
I need the rest of it,
said Desperaux.
The rest of what? Your neck?
The rest of the thread,
Well, I can't just hand it over to any old mouse,
said the threadmaster.
They say red thread is special, sacred, though I myself, after having spent so much time with it, know it for what it is.
What is it? Said Desperaux.
Thread,
said the threadmaster. He shrugged and took another loud bite of celery.
Nothing more, nothing less, but I pretend, friend, I pretend. And what, may I ask, do you intend to do with the thread?
Save the princess.
Ah, yes, the princess, the beautiful princess. That's how this whole story started, isn't it?
I have to save her. There's no one but me to do it.
It seems to be that way with most things. No one to do the really disagreeable jobs except oneself. And how exactly will you use a spool of thread to save a princess?
A rat has taken her and hidden her in the dungeon, so I have to go back to the dungeon, and it is full of twists and turns and hidden chambers.
Like a maze,
said the threadmaster. Yes, like a maze, and I have to find my way to her wherever she is hidden, and then I have to lead her back out again, and the only way to do that is with the thread. Gregory the jailer tied a rope around his ankle so that he would not get lost. As the mouse said this, he shuddered, thinking of Gregory and his broken rope, dying, lost in the darkness. Said Desperaux, I will use thread. The threadmaster nodded.
I see, he said.
He took a meditative bite of celery.
You, friend, are on a quest.
I don't know what that is, said Desperaux.
You don't have to know. You just have to feel compelled to do the thing, the impossible, important task at hand.
Impossible? Said Desperaux.
Impossible, said the threadmaster. Important.
He sat chewing his celery and staring somewhere past Desperaux, and then suddenly he leapt off his spool.
Who am I to stand in the way of a quest? He said. Roll her away.
I can have it?
Yes, for your quest.
Desperaux put his front paws up and touched the spool. He gave it an experimental push forward. Thank you, he said, looking into the eye of the threadmaster. I don't know your name.
Hovis.
Thank you, Hovis.
There's something else that belongs with the thread.
Hovis went into a corner and came back with a needle.
You can use it for protection.
Like a sword, said Desperaux, like a knight would have.
Yes,
said Hovis. He gnawed off a length of thread and used it to tie the needle around Despereaux's waist.
Like so.
Thank you, Hovis, said Desperaux. He put his right shoulder against the spool of thread and pushed it forward again.
Wait,
said Hovis. He stood up on his hind legs, put his paws on Despereaux's shoulders, and leaned in close to him. Desperaux smelled the sharp, clean scent of celery as the threadmaster bent his head, took hold of the thread around Despereaux's neck in his sharp teeth, and pulled on it hard.
There,
said Hovis, when the piece of thread broke and dropped to the ground. Now you're free. You see, you're not going into the dungeon because you have to. You're going because you choose to. Yes, said Desperaux, because I'm on a quest. The word felt good and right in his mouth. Quest. Say it, reader. Say the word quest out loud. It's an extraordinary word, isn't it? So small and yet so full of wonder, so full of hope. Goodbye, said Hovis, as Desperaux pushed the spool of thread out of the threadmaster's hole.
I've never known a mouse who's made it out of the dungeon only to go back into it again. Goodbye, friend. Goodbye, mouse among mice.
Chapter 43. What Cook Was Stirring. That night, Desperaux rolled the thread from the threadmaster's lair, along innumerable hallways and down 3 flights of stairs. Reader, allow me to put this in perspective for you. Your average house mouse, or castle mouse, if you will, weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 ounces. Desperaux, as you well know, was in no way average. In fact, he was so incredibly small that he weighed about half of what the average mouse weighs, 2 ounces. That is all. Think about it. He was nothing but 2 ounces of mouse, pushing a spool of thread that weighed almost as much as he did. Honestly, reader, what do you think the chances are of such a small mouse succeeding in his quest? Zip, 0, nada, goose eggs. But you must, when you are calculating the odds of the mouse's success, factor in his love for the princess. Love, as we've already discussed, is a powerful, wonderful, ridiculous thing, capable of moving mountains and spools of thread. Even with the love and purpose in his heart, Desperaux was very, very tired when he reached the door to the castle kitchen at midnight. His paws were shaking, and his muscles were jumping, and the place where his tail should be was throbbing. and he still had a very, very long way to go, into the kitchen and down the many stairs of the dungeon, and then through, somehow, some way, through the rat-filled darkness of the dungeon itself, not knowing where he was going. And, oh, reader, when he stopped to consider what lay ahead of him, Desperaux was filled with an icky feeling of despair. He leaned his head against the spool of thread, and he smelled celery there, and he thought of Hovis, and how Hovis seemed to believe in him in his quest. So the mouse raised his head and squared his shoulders and pushed the spool of thread forward again, into the kitchen, where he saw too late that there was a light burning. Desperaux froze. Cook was in the kitchen. She was bent over the stove. She was stirring something. Was it a sauce? No. Was it a stew? No. What Cook was stirring was soup. Soup, reader, in the king's own castle, against the king's law, right under the king's very nose. Cook was making soup. As the mouse looked on, Cook put her face into the steam rising from the pot and took a deep breath. She smiled a beatific smile, and the steam rose around her and caught the light of the candle and made a halo over her head. Desperaux knew how Cook felt about mice in her kitchen. He remembered quite clearly her instructions to Mig regarding himself. Kill him. The only good mouse is a dead mouse. But he had to go through Cook's kitchen to get to the dungeon door, and he had no time to waste. Soon daylight would dawn, and the whole castle would be awake, and a mouse would have no chance at all of pushing a spool of thread across the floor without attracting a great deal of attention. He would have to sneak past the mouse-hating Cook now. And so, screwing up his courage to the sticking place, Desperaux leaned against the spool of thread and set it rolling across the floor. Cook turned from the stove, a dripping spoon in her hand and a frightened look on her face, and shouted, "Who's there?" Chapter 44. Whose ears are those? "Who's there?" shouted Cook again. Desperaux wisely said nothing. The kitchen was silent. Said Cook. "Nothing. It's nothing at all. Just my nervous Nelly ears are playing tricks on me. You're an old fool," she said to herself as she turned back to the stove. "You're just an old fool afraid of being caught making soup." Desperaux slumped against the spool of thread, and as he leaned there, his heart pounding, his paws shaking, a small, wonderful something occurred. A midnight breeze entered the kitchen, and danced over to the stove and picked up the scent of the soup, and then swirled across the floor and delivered the smell right directly to the mouse's nose. Desperaux put his head up in the air. He sniffed. He sniffed some more. He had never in his life smelled anything so lovely, so inspiring. With each sniff he took, he felt himself growing stronger, braver. Cook leaned in close to the kettle and put the spoon in and took the spoon out and blew upon the spoon and then brought it to her lips and sipped and swallowed. She said. She took another sip. "Missing something," she said. "More salt, maybe." She put the spoon down and took up an enormous salt shaker and sprinkled salt into the kettle. And Desperaux, feeling emboldened by the smell of soup, again set to work pushing the spool of thread. "Quickly," he said to himself, rolling the spool across the floor. "Do it quickly. Do not think. Just push." Cook whirled, the salt shaker in her hand, and shouted, "Who goes there?" Desperaux stopped pushing. He hid behind the spool of thread as Cook took the candle from the stove and held it up high. The candlelight came closer, closer. "What's this?" The light came to rest directly on Desperaux's big ears, sticking up from behind the spool of thread. "Oh," said Cook, "whose ears are those?" And the light from the candle then shone full in Desperaux's face. "A mouse," said Cook. "A mouse in my kitchen." Desperaux closed his eyes. He prepared for his death. He waited, reader, and waited, and then he heard the sound of laughter. He opened his eyes and looked at Cook. "Ha, ha, ha, ha," said Cook. "For the first time in my life, I'm glad to see a mouse in my kitchen." "Why?" she asked. "Why am I glad?" "Because a mouse is not a king's man here to punish me for making soup. That is why. Because a mouse is not a king's man here to take me to the dungeon for owning a spoon." "A mouse. I, Cook, am glad to see a mouse." Cook's face was red and her stomach was shaking. "Hoo-hee," she said again. "And not just any mouse. A mouse with a needle tied around his waist. A mouse with no tail. Ain't it lovely?" She shook her head and wiped at her eyes. "Look, Mouse, these are extraordinary times, and because of that,
We must have some peace between us. I will not ask what you are doing in my kitchen, and you in return will tell no one what I am cooking."
She turned then and went back to the stove and set down the candle and picked up the spoon and again put it in this pot of soup and took it back out and tasted the soup, smacking her lips together.
"Not right," she said. "Not quite right. Missing something still."
Desperaux did not move. He could not move. He was paralyzed by fear. He sat on the kitchen floor. One small tear fell out of his left eye. He had expected Cook to kill him. Instead, reader, she had laughed at him, and he was surprised how much her laughter hurt. Chapter 45. Some soup. Cook stirred the soup, and then put the spoon down and held up the candle and looked over at Desperaux.
"What are you waiting for?" she said. "Go, go, go. There will never be another opportunity for a mouse to escape from my kitchen unharmed."
The smell of soup again wafted in Desperaux's direction. He put his nose up in the air. His whiskers trembled.
"Yes," said Cook, "that is soup that you are smelling. The princess, not that you would know or care, is missing, bless her good-hearted self. And times are terrible, and when times are terrible, soup is the answer. Don't it smell like the answer?"
"Yes," said Desperaux. He nodded. Cook turned away from him. She put the candle down and picked up her spoon and started to stir.
"Oh," she said, "these are dark days." She shook her head. "And I'm kidding myself. There ain't no point in making soup unless others eat it. Soup needs another mouth to taste it, another heart to be warmed by it." She stopped stirring. She turned and looked at Desperaux. "Mouse," said Cook, "would you like some soup?" And then, without waiting for an answer, she took a saucer and spooned some soup into it and set it on the kitchen floor. "Come closer," she said. "I don't aim to hurt you, I promise." Desperaux sniffed. The soup smelled wonderful, incredible. Keeping one eye on Cook, he stepped out from behind the spool of thread and crept closer. "Go on," said Cook. "Taste it." Desperaux stepped onto the saucer. Soup covered his paws. He bent his head to the hot broth. He sipped. Oh, it was lovely. Garlic and chicken and watercress, the same soup that Cook had made the day the Queen died. "How is it?" asked Cook anxiously. "Wonderful," said Desperaux. "Too much garlic?" said Cook, wringing her fat hands. "No," said Desperaux. "It's perfect." Cook smiled. "See," she said, "there ain't a body, be it mouse or man, that ain't made better by a little soup." Desperaux bent his head and sipped again, and Cook stood over him and smiled, saying, "It don't need a thing, then. Is that what you're saying? It's just right?" Desperaux nodded. He drank the soup in big, noisy gulps, and when he stepped out of the saucer, his paws were damp and his whiskers were dripping and his stomach was full. Cook said to him, "Not done already, are you? Surely you ain't done. You must want more." "I can't," said Desperaux. "I don't have time. I'm on my way to the dungeon to save the princess." "Ho, ho!" the cook laughed. "You and Mouse are going to save the princess?" "Yes," said Desperaux. "I'm on a quest." "Well, don't let me stand in your way." And so it was that Cook held open the door to the dungeon, while Desperaux rolled the spool of thread through it. "Good luck," she said to him. "Good luck saving the princess." She closed the door behind him and then leaned against it and shook her head. "And if that ain't an indication of what strange days these are," she said to herself, "then I don't know what is. Me, Cook, feeding a mouse soup, and then wishing him good luck in saving the princess. Oh my, strange days indeed." Now, an hour has gone by, but there aren't that many pages left. Oh, well, I suppose there are. There's another whole 32 pages or so. We'll finish up tomorrow. It'll just be a short one tomorrow. So tune in tomorrow. We'll start with chapter 46 tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Stay safe. Stay healthy. I will see you tomorrow. Have a great Saturday evening. Night, whichever.